Good evening from Los Angeles. This is Freeda Saba and you're watching The Global Village. Myth or fact? Myth or Fact is the title of the new series of discussion and interviews I'm going to conduct on the occasion of the 39th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution back in 1979 and the role the United States played during and prior to 1979 Iranian uprising. As our first discussion, we're going to talk to Houman Fakhimi, a criminal lawyer and political analyst who has been following the Iranian Revolution and its developments since 1976 to present. Welcome to the program, Mr. Fakhimi, where there is a strong feeling among the people, Iranian and Americans, that the U.S. administration has great part in removal of the Shah, especially President Carter. What is your take on that?
You're absolutely right that there is certainly this perception out there in the public, especially amongst Iranian Americans and definitely amongst those who belong to the Republican Party and the more conservatives, that the Iranian Revolution was concocted and it was planned by the Carter administration, namely the National Security Advisor Brzezinski. Then they conclude from there that because Iran's revolution was the start of the fundamentalist Islamic wave in the Middle East, therefore what we see today with regards to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and everything else can be traced back to policies undertaken by Carter and Brzezinski. I have devoted a substantial amount of my time to this issue, and I've looked at it from a perspective of an attorney. You and I have studied law. You know, this is what I do. When I go to court, I have to present evidence to the judge before I can convince him or the jury or her or the jury as to my client's case. And before I can introduce evidence to the court, to the jury, that evidence has to be credible. So when I started looking at this from a student of history, the more I read, the more I learn, the more I come across credible evidence, credible documents, credible information, which actually points to the other way around. That being that the Carter administration had no role in intentionally removing the Shah from Iran or helping Khomeini come to power. When I say intentionally, I mean that there were certainly shortcomings in the way that the Carter administration dealt with that crisis, but it falls far below the level of having been intentional. I would say that they were probably negligent, if you were to put it in legal terms, and they were probably not well prepared to deal with the crises that came up in the summer of 78 mainly and ended up in the February of 79 with the fall of the Shah of Iran. But most certainly to say that President Carter and his National Security Advisor and administration planned or conspired or wanted the Shah to be removed is countered by thousands of pages of declassified documents which are being released on a regular basis because we're way past the 25 years, as you indicated, of the revolution.
Why we should expect that these declassified documents are 100% true?
Well, number one, we're not just relying, if we were to use the court analogy, we're not just relying on declassified information. We are relying on the events as they unfolded, as they were described in daily newspapers and accounts. We're also relying on personal biographies of people who were involved personally on the day-to-day affairs of that period. Now, when you put that side by side with with the declassified documents which have been released and documents which had been available but not researched thoroughly, you will see that this narrative of conspiracy against the Shah by the Carter administration fails. Now, why should we believe any of that information? Is because it's all the information we have. Why should we believe, especially the declassified documents, as being accurate? Is to think otherwise would mean that our government is involved in such a degree of sabotage and conspiracy against the American people and the world that the president and his administration and the ambassador to Iran were sitting around daily while the country was burning up with the revolutionary fervor. They are concocting telegrams and cables to send back and forth from Iran to the United States and return, also that in 30 years you and I can read them and we can say, oh, okay, they really didn't want this revolution to happen. That's just preposterous. And also because when you read these telegrams, you will see that there are points in there which are very embarrassing for the Carter administration. As I indicated, the evidence does not exonerate Carter administration as far as their role in potentially helping the government of Iran fall. It shows that this role was not intentional, rather it was based on faulty intelligence that was provided to the president and also a misunderstanding of the region, and more importantly, their obsession with putting together the Camp David, eventually peace accord, and the SALT treaty, which they were entering into with USSR. So Iran really was not on their radar. As Carter had indicated, in the December of 77, when he visited Iran, they considered Iran an island of stability, which didn't need to be paid much attention to. And they were disregarding the information that was coming from the Iran desk of State Department and also from their the Ambassador Sullivan, who was in Iran at the point, and relying instead on CIA's information, on NIE's national intelligence estimates, which were provided, and also on Mr. Brzezinski's calculations based on those intelligence information.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world. This is a great tribute to you, Your Majesty, and to your leadership, and to the respect and the admiration and love which your people give to you.
Was Brzezinski or Carter enemy of the Shah of Iran?
The facts just show absolutely the opposite. If we go back to the election of 1976, 1976 was basically a reactionary, if you will, election. It was an election in which someone from an outsider became president. He became president, that being President Carter, mainly because the country was ready for a change. Watergate, the CIA scandals, the Vietnam War had worn down the American psyche. They wanted someone to come in there and promote a peaceful government, if you will. Carter had ran on the platform of human rights, on the platform of directly criticizing the CIA and Watergate. As we all remember in the debates with President Ford, Carter referred to a national disgrace. And by the national disgrace, he was referring to the Watergate situation, the way Vietnam War had been handled, and to CIA's involvement in different countries, namely Chile and other countries. So he came into office as this guy who was, looked by many as someone who is going to put pressure on dictators all around the world. But once he got into office, the reality is that he did not exert any influence or pressure on Shah at all. In fact, if we read the reports which were coming out from the congressional reports of the period, we will see that also, although the Church Commission, Senator Church, a fierce opponent of the Shah, were pushing to cut off sales of military equipment to Iran, the Carter administration pursued the same policy that the Ford administration had pursued, which was to give, Iran the carte blanche on what they want to buy. This was contrary to Carter's campaign. So most people who will look at this issue from a very cursory point of view, they remember his campaign speeches and his campaign slogans about not selling arms, but they fail to go into the record and see that was there really a change with regards to how much arms were sold to Iran, and if there was, which side was Carter on? And if it's put that aside, we will see, and hopefully we'll get to it further on, we will see through these cables and through the declassified documents released that Brzezinski and Carter under the influence of Brzezinski, until the late months of 1978 and even to mid-January 79, were very hopeful that Shah will overcome this issue. And Brzezinski and the Department of Defense, very much in favor of what he referred to as the iron fist, referring to supporting Dr. Bakhtiyar and the government of Iran so that Shah can be stabilized in Iran. And by that I'm referring to there was also a differing opinion within the administration. That opinion was from Department of State and Secretary Vance, and from obviously the embassy in Iran. They were much less hopeful that the Shah would be able to survive, or they were more inclined to ask the president to live up to the promises that he had made in the campaign, which was to put more pressure on the Shah to bring about the winds of change that he had talked about. The Shah of Iran did implement certain very minor changes in 1977 and 78, but the evidence shows, the documents shows that none of that was because of pressure from Carter. It was in Shah's own reaction. It was in his psyche that now, because of all the slogans made throughout the campaign, he had to implement certain changes. But the evidence is devoid, the documentation is devoid of any major pressure on Shah from Carter or from Brzezinski.
So what you say to people that there have been so many contacts between Khomeini and the U.S. administration? At least we know...
Well, I would say that is absolutely wrong. I have spent hours reading the declassified documents which have been published. Anyone can go online and review most of them. Go to WikiLeaks, pick the period of late 78, early 79, search for titles like Heuser, tag words or keywords like Heuser, Sullivan, Brzezinski. You will see these documents pop up. And then if you want to read more, the best place to go right now is probably President Carter's library in Georgia, where the cables issued and sent by late General Heuser from Iran to the President and to the Department of Defense have been released. Unfortunately, they're not electronically available, but they are available in hard copy. When you read those, you will see there was no contact between between the government of the United States and Ayatollah Khomeini's campaign until late December of 78, early January of 79.
There have been 3 meetings with Yazdi, then elect foreign minister of the Islamic regime.
Yes, as I was saying, you will see that there were no contacts between them until late 78 and in January of 79. In January of 79 or late 78, Mike Gerzyowski, I believe is his name, has a meeting with Mr. Yazdi in Paris. And from there, Richard Kottem also gets involved and has meetings with Yazdi. And those meetings start late in the process. And those meetings, by the way, were communicated to the King of Iran. The King of Iran, the Shah, knew about those contacts because those contacts were, again, directed as convincing Mr. Yazdi and Ayatollah Khomeini to give Bakhtiyar a chance. And that was what they were working for. Alternative A was to give Bakhtiyar a chance, and the way to do it was to get Khomeini to call for a calm down. In fact, there is a very important telegram from General Heuser, but that he sends it to State Department, not the Department of Defense. So this is online, and that cable, General Heuser informs Sullivan, and through him, obviously, the president, that the Shah of Iran was very angry, and he was telling them in no uncertain terms that it looks like you want the government of Bakhtiyar to fail. When they ask him why, he says, why aren't you contacting Khomeini? And why aren't you putting pressure on him to call for a calm down? So when I read these articles from some sources, including BBC, which they refer to these documents without putting it in perspective, it's really disheartening to see that there is so much information out there and the media is doing such a poor job, or is doing its job to hide the facts. Because it is true there were contacts in January and in December. It is true there were contacts after that. But what's important is those contacts were done with the knowledge of the Shah of Iran, because he was hoping that those contacts will work. Now, if we're going to look at contacts that individuals outside of the government of Iran, U.S. had with Yazdi and with the Khomeini camp, yes, absolutely. Ramsey Clark and other former U.S. government officials had contacts with the government of Iran, but that had nothing to do with the Carter administration. Those were just activists who were in contact with Iranians, and they were passing on, and Iranians were trying to influence them any way they can, just as now, the opposition members are trying to have contacts with everyone they can in order to influence it. But the government of President Carter did not have direct contacts, at least according to all the evidence that's out there, until late 78. And the facts actually show that if they had, it probably would have helped Iran, it probably would have helped the Shah, because they may have been able to implement what they had in mind, which was to get Dr. Bakhtiyar-like government in power and successful. Maybe if Bakhtiyar had been appointed instead of Sharif Emami, that would have worked. But at that point, there was absolutely no contact between anyone on the U.S. government side and anyone from the opposition, because as late as October or September of 1978, that's almost a month after 17th of Shahrivar, in which many can consider a watershed moment. Even a month after that, the CIA did an internal memo on the status of the Iranian government, and the internal memo, in no uncertain terms, states that the government of Iran is in good shape. And what they say is they indicate that the government of Iran Iran is not in a revolutionary or even in a pre-revolutionary stage. This is in September of 78.
How could they miss such
CIA was providing to the president at Brzezinski. They remained very hopeful. Now the question becomes, how could CIA have been so wrong 4 months before the revolution, telling the president and Brzezinski, the national security advisor, that Iran is not even in a pre-revolutionary
Yes, that
state.
was my question. How they could miss Islamic revolution?
That's a great question. And for that, we really need to go back to this 1976 election that we talked about. In that election, just like the 2009 election, in which President Obama basically came to power as a purveyor of change, Carter had won based on his policy of human rights and his policy of cleaning up the government. At that point, Americans were angry at Watergate, were tired of Vietnam, and they were embarrassed by all the information coming out about CIA and its different participations in different military events. So Carter basically had promised that I come into power, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean house. And one of the first things that the Carter administration did was referred to as a Halloween massacre. Halloween massacre was basically an incident in October of 1977, in which I believe 28 or 29 major agents from the CIA were removed from power and office. They were fired. Those agents were mostly the more gung-ho ones, the ones who were more involved in sabotage overseas and things like that. There are some, and this is just pure conjecture, there are some who argue that once the CIA considered this to be a slight. The CIA considered Carter administration's treatment of intelligence agencies and his treatment of what they have done before with such disdain that it was basically losing respect for that agency, losing the respect the agency had in public. Therefore, they were not inclined to help the new president, who had very little knowledge of the Middle East. That's why those reports were the way they were. For instance, there is a report in I beg your pardon, summer of 1977, in which they reported to President Carter that Iran, this is before he went and gave the speech, Island of Stability, in which they said the Shah will be an active participant in Iranian life well into the 1980s.
80s, yes.
And the prospect was for evolution, not revolution. So they were talking up the Shah. They were telling the president that this man is going to be in power well into the 1980s. This is in 1977. What's interesting is 2 years before that, IRNA had basically, and INR, which is the Bureau of Intelligence and Resources, had prepared a report on Iran, a report which is part of the National Intelligence Estimates. This is 1975, 2 years before the CIA report saying the Shah will be in power into the 80s. The NIE of 1975 had indicated that there is strife in Iran, and it had specifically referred to the religious opposition which was gaining power, and it had been very critical of the Shah, and it had advised then President Ford that something has to be done. So that's the report CIA had in 75. In 77 and 78, they are giving glowing reviews of the government of Iran. What is that? Was it some kind of sabotage? Was the president being set up? Obviously, no one knows. Some make that those kind of arguments. But what is fanning the fuel, adding fuel to those kind of conspiracy theories is that the Department of State, which after President Carter took office was ran by Cyrus Vance. Cyrus Vance himself, not a favorite, not a big supporter of the Shah. Department of State in 1977 also did a report on Iran. And the report in Iran indicated that Iran will face rising social and economic tension and would ultimately confront mounting dissatisfaction and discontent amongst groups that traditionally form the bedrock of support for the monarchy. So what you see is Department of State seem to know that Iran is pregnant with major issues, whereas the CIA and national security were apparently not in the loop. So what happens, unfortunately, in the summer of 78 and in the months that ensue, the intelligence agencies, CIA and national security agencies, they prevail over the president. And the president decides that he's going to listen not to Cyrus Vance and Sullivan, who was in Iran, who were critical of the Shah, but rather to Mr. Brzezinski and the Department of Defense, which were calling for the iron fist and telling him that the Shah will be in control well into the 1980s. And that is why it's so it's ridiculous when we hear people, claim that there was some kind of a collusion, if you will, between Carter and Brzezinski to remove the Shah. The person people should be looking at is probably the CIA, the group that, gave misinformation. But if you want to pick on anyone for not being pro-Shah, it was the Department of State and Sullivan, and their words were not ruling the day in Washington, D.C.
So, in the same line, you don't think this rumor about Carter donating a few millions to Khomeini campaign and Khomeini camp, it's not true either?
Well, I mean, it's so ridiculous.
It's a rumor. Many people here and there they believe in, and I have seen some fake documents that it sounds very fake, but that's the rumor that we want to clarify that now.
Unfortunately, there are people, who instead of going to the thousands of pages of documents that are out there, it takes time to read these documents. They're not easy to read. They're not easy to find. It takes time to read national intelligence estimates. It takes time to review reports from the CIA, which basically discuss their own mistakes. The CIA issued 2 reports in which One of them is the Carter administration and the arc of crisis, and it talks about the mistakes made with regards to Iran. What were those mistakes? These are thousands of pages of documents which contain the intelligence agency's information on Iran. Now, if we're going to set these aside and listen to some kind of a rumor out there that Carter administration wrote a check to Khomeini, then we have to ask the question, it was Khomeini's camp that needed Carter. Shouldn't they be paying Carter to let them gain power in Iran, not vice versa? And also, where is Carter, you know, a man of very limited means, going to get millions of dollars to write a check from what account? Yeah. Whose account was this? Right now, we see what's going on with this country. The beauty of America is there is transparency and there is law and order. So if there was a check written from anyone to anyone, where is it?
Yeah. Do you know if Reagan accused Carter of removing Shah? That was another rumor too. What do you say?
Absolutely. You will see on Facebook and other social media that those who like to, you know, pump up this kind of myth, they will refer to a statement made by President Reagan that Carter was instrumental in Shah being removed. That statement comes from a debate they had. In a debate they had, Reagan was basically accusing Carter, not saying you were instrumental as wanting to remove the Shah. He was accusing him of saying that, you know, your policies led to that. That was an accusation made by the president of by the candidate to be the president of the United States in a debate. Many accusations are made in debates. Fact of the matter is, President Reagan came into power. He was in power for 8 years. He had the ability to get his hands on any document, any check written or cashed by anyone from the United States to show that the government of the United States was instrumental in bringing Khomeini to power. They never did because no such a thing existed. But if President Reagan meant that Carter administration was negligent in handling Iran, and that led to the fall of the regime, I would agree with that. The government of the United States did not handle the Iranian crisis right. And the reason and by that I mean they gave up on the Shah, or they started pushing for the Bakhtiyar alternative way too late. Had that alternative for a constitutional monarchy by someone like Bakhtiyar or someone else, you know, who could have had some credibility, been thought about in 1977, you know, we probably would have had a different result than we did.
Exactly. You know, Reagan made a deal with Khomeini camp that do not release the news about freeing of the hostages until Reagan is in power. What do you say to that?
You know, that gets into a whole separate debate, obviously, that deals with the hostage crisis. You know, I have my own, you know, readings on that, and but I'm going to be very honest, there is no declassified document from the Reagan era yet. So we don't have anything with the declassified document on that topic, and it would very well maybe because they are keeping a secret. I don't know. So there is no document that supports that kind of assertion.
Yeah. But that's what it happened. You know, that's the news was released right, you know, after he was elected, not before.
Yes, as I said. Again, because we're doing this program, you and I are doing it very methodically and scientifically. Yes. I can't say there is any released declassified document that supports that assertion. But it was very odd that in October of 1980, when the government of Iran set 4 conditions, Khomeini set 4 conditions for release of hostages, and those 4 conditions were met by Carter. Immediately when those 4 conditions were communicated to the government of Iran, and the Iranian president Banisad at that point, who was very hopeful that the hostages can be released and Iran could join their international community and get the weaponry it needed to defend itself, for some reason, the Iranian parliament, which was anti-Banisad, and the parliament which was controlled by hardliners, at that point reneged on the offer of, you know, 4 counts and the 4 conditions, and exerted or demanded few more conditions. Those conditions were asking for billions of dollars more. Well, as expected, those conditions were not accepted, and hostages were not released in time for the election. All polling had showed that if hostages had been released based on those four conditions, Carter probably would have won the presidency. But those conditions were not accepted. Iranians asserted new conditions, and what they did is the United States said absolutely no to those new conditions. Iran kept demanding those same conditions. The Iranian hardliners kept demanding those conditions until a week before inauguration of Reagan. All of a sudden, they dropped those conditions. Mr. Behzad Navawi has a lot of answering to do on behalf of the Iranians, and his people, to the Iranians, because he was the negotiator at Algiers. He recently has indicated we received everything we had demanded for, and that is an absolute lie. The United States government, the Carter administration, stuck to the four conditions that it had accepted in October, did not give Iran anything more. Iranians completely capitulated, and they accepted the terms of the Algiers Accord, and they did it in such a way that, as you indicated, the hostages were released exactly as Mr. Carter was being sworn into office. And because of that, because of what happened afterwards and the dealings President Carter had with Iran, many people believe that there had been collusion. There is no document I have seen, but these are the facts.
Okay. I have another question, my last question. We are getting close to the end of the program, so I make my last question. Did you know why Iran and Shah been on news a lot, on news during 1967 and 78?
What happened is in 1960s, Iran has always been in the news. It's always been in the news for some reason or another.
Especially on those years, did media played a role, or
are we talking 78 or 60s?
76 and 78.
76, yes. What happened is after Shah of Iran took such a control of OPEC and became the eagle of OPEC, pushing for the price of oil to go up, and he was a flamboyant individual, obviously. He gained a lot of notoriety and attention, and he was obviously and that was putting a lot of pressure on U.S. and the British governments. He also gave a lot of interviews, which were some ways kind of, incendiary, if you will. And at that point, declassified documents have established that at the same time, the U.S. government under the Ford administration was having secret meetings with Saudi Arabia and Zaki Yamani to enter into some kind of an agreement with them. Secretary Simon and Secretary Rumsfeld, both of them were huge enemies of the Shah. And this is all reflected in these declassified documents, they were calling on President Ford to basically put pressure on the Shah of Iran, because this guy is not our guy anymore, and let's work with Saudi Arabia. They eventually did that after the meeting in Doha. The book, The Oil Kings, has really discussed these facts at length. Doha
collusion.
What happens is that Shah of Iran did not back down. There's a very interesting, there's a conversation in which Kissinger is having with Nixon, with Ford, and a couple of other people. Kissinger is against putting pressure on Shah of Iran, and he tells them that you can tackle him, but you will break him. Yeah. And his point was, you can put pressure on him as much as you want, but you're going to break him. And the pressure put in by the Ford administration, in my opinion, had a great deal to do with the fall of the Shah of Iran because of economic.
Yeah, I'm afraid we ran out of time, and we have to conclude our program. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your input. And I hope we can continue in our next segment of the program.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we are reaching the end of the program. Thanks for joining us, and hope to see you next time.